And welcome back to Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park. And thanks for joining us at our new home at Secular TV. And joining us tonight, we have a special guest. But before we get to that, a couple things to get out of the way. As you may notice, we are on Secular TV this evening, and this is going to be our new home for the time being. And we have, as you may have noticed, moved into Wednesdays. And we're going to be Wednesday for a while at least, so we thanks for your patience for shuffling stuff around and all of that fun stuff. And before we get started, too, I just wanted to give a shout-out to our friends at No Religion Required, Bobby C. and Miss Ashley. Bobby had a bit of a scare at the hospital last night, but we're really happy to hear that he is just fine and hanging out at home, and from what I hear, watching us. So, hey guys, glad to hear everything's A-okay, and best wishes going forward. And Beth, you had a little something you wanted to talk about as well.
Well, as many of you know, our regular listeners and those that follow my blog, one of the issues and incidents I have been following the past year concerns Michaela Salt. She was the 11-year-old Native American girl who refused chemo to pursue indigenous and other alternative medicines. Well, she died Monday. She lost a battle that she should have won due to a stroke. So, I know we have mentioned her case a couple times on our show. Basically, she went to a woo-woo doctor, and I'm not talking about her indigenous medicine, but she basically went to a quack at a Florida health resort, which is actually a licensed massage establishment. They were using cold laser therapy, vitamin C injections, and a strict raw food diet.
Wow.
With chemo, she had a 75 to 95% chance of surviving and living a long life. So, I'm a little pissed about that.
Yeah, it's one thing if you're an adult and you want to make that kind of a choice for yourself. And if you want to say, I'm going to go and throw my hat in with the woo because I've tried everything else, or I don't trust medicine, or whatever, that's your choice. But when it's a child, and I just have such a hard time with that too. And, I've read where that child made the choice too. I know. Because a lot of times they don't understand the implications, or they've been told, from the get-go that this is the only way to be, and a lot like religious indoctrination. I mean, how many of us grew up believing stupid things because that's what we were told, right? So,
Like Moses exists?
Good segue. Good segue. So tonight, I would love to introduce our guest. She goes by her pen name and her new pen name, Acharya S. or DM Murdock. And thank you for joining us at the show.
Well, hi there. I appreciate you having me on. My real name is DM Murdock, but I don't give out my first name.
That's a lot of
people
us
think they know it.
People think they know a lot.
I know, and they try to torture me with what they think is my real name, but I don't go by the name that everybody thinks is my name.
Did they play 20 questions with Acharya's name?
Oh, who would that be this time?
I don't know.
I wanted to ask you a question. I'm looking at, because I gave out the AOA.fm/live URL to my lists and so forth, but I'm not sure that anyone, I just posted a chat comment in there, and I'm not sure anyone can actually hear the show there. So do you know what's going on with that? Or?
I can't actually watch the show there, so just so people know, our dear friend Cash at Atheists on Air, he helps us out with a lot of stuff, and that's actually his live chat that he allows us to use. We are piped through Secular TV, So on the Secular TV YouTube channel, and there's a link I sent out earlier. You can find it on my Facebook.
I see.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I just sent the Google link too, so if people are not getting it, they can come over here.
The Google link will be the one to go to. So the AOA.fm/live is where you can join us in the chat room, and you can chat amongst yourselves or even posit a question for DM Murdock if you like. So DM Murdock, in case people haven't heard of you, I should say be living under a rock or something, I don't know. She has been writing fabulous books for, I think it's over 20 years now. A lot of it to do with the historical Jesus, but you have now branched out into the historical Moses, which I find kind of exciting.
The mythical Jesus and Moses, yes.
Yes.
The lack of historical figures.
Exactly. And oh gosh, close to 10 years ago, I used to belong to a Yahoo group, and that I was challenged about that once. And even back then, I went and looked it up, and I kind of went, there really isn't much in the way of proof of Jesus out there. What do you know?
Right.
So,
yeah. What you eventually dig up, if you start that's at the beginning of the quest, looking at the historical record and finding there really is absolutely nothing, and that the so-called proofs that people proffer in order to demonstrate a historical Jesus of Nazareth come much later in the literary record, and even those, upon close scrutiny, Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, Thales, all that, they do not hold up to close scrutiny. They're just not what they appear to be. And I have all of this stuff written about in not just books, but many articles. If you go to my websites, truthbeknown.com, stellarhousepublishing.com, freethoughtnation.com, and I have a new one, astrotheology.net, and you start to investigate this information. You can do searches there. You find that it's all a lot of smoke and mirrors. So that's what I've been doing all this time, trying to expose the non-historicity of the tales, and then exploring what they really mean, where they come from, and that the back end part of it is my favorite. After we're done realizing that this is not a historical story, there's no evidence of it corroborated anywhere, what does it mean, where did it come from? And because that part, you can go off in 1,000 different directions, and you learn fascinating information about the ancient world that is not being put out there. It's not being taught in schools. It's not being emphasized. It's being suppressed, in fact, in order to uphold the fallacious history of Christian origins.
I saw that you'd mentioned in other places how, you would ask, why aren't other mythologies being taught out there? That was something that you found a bit odd.
Yeah. Did Moses exist? This is the book we were going to focus on tonight. At the beginning, I say, why is not the Epic of Gilgamesh being taught from the pulpit, or the Tales of Dionysus? Because these two in particular, these two figures from the Eastern Mediterranean region, these two in particular had multiple attributes in common with Moses, and the conclusion, after you inspect these tales and the history of how myth and culture developed around that region, you start to realize they must have plucked a significant amount of, let's say, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the myths of Dionysus, and reworked them to create this Moses character. And so, of course, this isn't going to be taught from the pulpit, because they're trying to sell this idea that this is a historical account.
Yeah, and I remember I've actually spoke with Aaron Ra not too long ago, and he was lamenting how, in Texas they're saying, oh, Moses was real and we're going to put him in the textbook because, he helped found the Constitution. I'm like, what?
Yes, right, exactly. Well, that was a show that he and I did together, and he's very passionate about that. He's got a more recent video out where he's discussing the Ten Commandments and addressing Dennis Prager, and at the beginning of that, he has a picture of my book cover, and so I'm very thrilled to be associated with this effort, because I think what he's doing is really important, and he's leading the way in that regard to keep our secular nation and the separation of church, mosque, temple, and state, that keep that wall intact. It's really important. Otherwise, we're going to start losing a lot of freedoms, and whenever we go in that direction, we end up with some kind of inquisition, and it could be the latest crazy monotheistic religion that will be imposed on us, and I do not want to go that way. So, if my book is a milestone or a watershed in that movement, then I'm thrilled.
Absolutely. Well, go ahead, Beth.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things, like in the beginning of your introduction, you referred to Joseph Campbell. And basically, the thought was that you placed was that the Bible has been perceived widely as a sacrosanct subject that alone among the world's religious literature and traditions must be treated as if it has no mythology in it.
Exactly.
And I mean, when I read that, obviously it's like on page 1.
Yeah.
But all throughout the book, and yes, I did actually read your whole book, which I said before.
That's amazing.
I finished it at 8:30 this morning.
Impressive.
But I think what people get confused about is they don't know what myth is, they don't know what mythology is, and they don't know what mythicism is.
Yeah, you would think more people would be aware of mythology when Joseph Campbell was around. Now, I was referring to or inferring the Campbell quote in Occidental Mythology, where he's talking about the gods and heroes of European West, and then previous to that he'd been talking about biblical tales. And then he moves on and he says to this, when he goes to the European, he goes, fortunately, it will not be necessary to argue that Greek, Celtic, or Germanic myths were mythological. The peoples themselves knew they were myths, and the European scholars discussing them have not been overborne by the idea of something uniquely holy about their topic. And what I read into that, and I'm quite sure he meant, is that he's basically complaining that he can't really talk freely about biblical stories as myth. So I can. I'm not afraid to do so. And in fact, when you crack open that wall, you discover all this great stuff inside, all these myths that I pulled up and found, and like I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then stories of serpent cults, and you realize that the world in which this text was composed, the book, the Bible, was much richer and deeper and fuller than the picture we're getting of this shallow, dark, shady place that the Bible depicts its emergence in. So we should rejoice this information because it's very profound, and as we can tell from what Aaron is doing, it can help preserve our freedoms.
Well, yeah, and I think too, like further on you had said that in regards to myth or in mythology, that it's pregnant with meaning. And I think by you pulling out all the different parallels to, like, Gilgamesh, as you said, and Dionysus and all that, I kind of, like, towards the end, because I was kind of rushing I was just like, holy moly. You pulled out some that were just, you wouldn't think about it, but if you combine it all together, you can see where your premise comes from.
Yes. To continue about the myth actually having meaning, which is what you were asking previously about people not remembering Joseph Campbell's great series on exploring mythology. The word myth is being used, or has been used for some time now, to dismiss things. That's just a myth. It's a myth.
Exactly.
When in fact, from studies like Campbell engaged in, we know that myth has meaning. So it's when you say it in that context, it's just a myth, you're dismissing it, it's meaningless, it's not true, it's false. But when we're discussing it, we're talking about a non-literal or allegorical idea or action or a narrative describing something that has some kind of meaning down the road, not necessarily happening in real life. Actually, that's the very definition. It didn't happen in the third dimensional plane in reality. It's allegorical. It's symbolic. It's a fairy tale, but fairy tales have meaning, and they're not. You don't just dismiss them and go, it's just a fairy tale. So the same thing is with myths. And so, yes, the stuff I kept digging up was wondrous indeed. And when you know the background, you have to fill in the whole milieu of the region. People don't do that when they're reading the Bible. It's like it just happened in a vacuum, and there was all the other people. Let's not learn about their culture because it was all evil and despicable. There's a whole, in this particular story with the Exodus and myth and the Moses myth, there's this whole hostility towards Egypt. And so we don't like Egypt. We don't want to know about Egypt. We want to bury Egypt. We don't, it's got disgusting things. It's vile. And so that's really, the cultural bigotry has led to a tremendous amount of ignorance and has darkened that whole region where people just don't even realize what life was like there and then. And so I'm shining a spotlight, a very bright spotlight on this region and these periods so people can realize the context of these stories. And it's rich indeed.
What I found interesting is you talking about how that kind of nomadic lifestyle really contributed to the whole birth of the myth, traveling in various areas.
Oh, yeah. What we discover is the Israelites emerged from this great Amoritish people collection, a compilation of peoples, a massive compilation that included numerous different tribes, Shasu, Hapiru. These are Bedu or Bedouin nomadic tribes that had been part of different settled areas. For example, in the northwestern part of Canaan, where Ugarit is, which is on the coast, and then you have Mari, which is a little more inland. The Amorites had settled there at one point. This is happening in the second millennium. And on the fringes were kind of rabble, and they were rough, coarse people. And then you had these nomads who would come and go, and they had different occupations, and then there were robbers, and you see all these stories about them in ancient texts, particularly Egypt, because they, as nomads, they traveled around. The Amorites kept moving. These are Western Semitic peoples, different tribes. Their language is Amoritish, but they're also interacting with the Ugarites and the Canaanites. So these are Canaanite people, but they start to move around, and they end up in Babylon, and they're the people who set up the Babylonian civilization. They essentially destroyed the Sumerians, and adopted their religion, which was highly evolved, into their own, and gave Babylonian or Western Semitic names to the Sumerian deities. And then they start taking the myths that we find at the beginning of the Bible, like Genesis and so forth, and rewriting those to revolve in their own language and to reflect their own eras and so forth. And then that same Amoritish people, they're also evicted from Babylon at a certain point. And, of course, they merge and assimilate, so not everyone is removed, and influences don't stop. They have established themselves, but they swirl around and end up down in the southeast of the Levant. And it's at that point where now you're starting to get, they're moving into the Hebrew area. They're starting to speak Hebrew, Hebraic, Proto-Hebrew. You're getting the Shasu down in the very southeast, and those Shasu end up in Egypt. And then the Habaru are affecting Egypt too, because Egypt is moving up into the Ugarit northern coastal area. And so this group eventually ends up going in and out of Egypt. And again, there are multiple tribes, Shasu, all these nomads. They're going in and out of Egypt, and they eventually settle the Samaritan and Judean hills, which are kind of right smack in the middle, off the coastline, and then Jerusalem is down at the bottom of that. And so they're settling that area, and from that group, and influxes from the coastal region of the Ugarites and the Canaanites, that merger is what created the Israelites. They come out of that merger of those peoples. And so all those different influences are being absorbed into this group. They're not a refined lot. They don't have writing. These are orally told myths. They're not really detailed, kind of rough at that time. But when the Ugarites fleeing the coastline end up in that region, somehow some of their very ancient mythology is getting incorporated into it with the Babylonians and the Shasu from the east and so forth, or southeast. And they bring in, for example, the tale of Baal versus Yam. And Baal means Lord, and Yahweh was called Baal in Hosea, and Yam is sea. So you have the Lord God versus the sea, and the Red Sea, Yam Saf. And so you can see the core mythology coming in and how it starts to be formed in that region. And the fact that the name Israel itself means El prevails. El is the high god of the northwest Semitic people, in particular the Ugarites and the Canaanites. And so El prevails he's their high god, which is why we have this whole Elohim structure in the Bible.
Right.
And so, yeah, all of this stuff is laid out in my book, and I'm glad you guys read it.
It's amazing just how much goes into the creation of what we think of as one little myth, because we have the end story. We don't even really think about all the sort of tentacles that go into it. And I think you said there was something like 52 different characters that could have influenced the end myth of Moses.
I'm not sure I added a figure on that. Maybe somebody I was writing about, like Voltaire or one of those. I've got a whole extensive section in the back where I talk about the scholarship that had recognized, starting I think it was the 17th century, they started recognizing the similarities between Moses and Dionysus, and this scholarship was developed over a period of centuries. So there's this huge body of this. I couldn't even fit it all in the book. I had to do it a second, an extra ebook edition. So that within that scholarship, it's possible somebody was talking about the different characters that were involved in it. But yes, there would be elements of not only Gilgamesh and Dionysus, 'cause a lot of the Moses tale appears to have been drawn from those two. But there were also these snake deities, called Mush.
I found that really fascinating because you talk about Moses, that story with, my staff turned into a snake, but it takes on a whole different meaning when you link it to these snake worship or snake gods.
Yes, that becomes a totem or a like part of the religious sect for sure. And then my eyes bugged out when I was encountering this information because I do a lot of analyzing of language. I worked in something like 20 languages if you include all the Semitic languages for this book, and I lay them out, I think, so that people can see it for themselves and actually learn some of this stuff, rather than some flowery translation that doesn't even resemble the original. But I would came across things like the Mashmashu Babylonian priesthood that had as one of its deities significantly a serpent entity, and the spells that they were involved in was painting blood on the lintel. That was the Babylonian priesthood used to do that to prevent evil spirits from crossing. And so that element in the Moses story need not be historical at all. It's a ritual that they've incorporated into a mythical tale.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so if you have these all these mush, there's Gilgamesh, mush, it's the same word basically, and then there's mush that is an ancient serpent god, and there's that go into a whole serpentine theme in different parts of the book. That information falling into place, and it was absolutely fascinating to me too. So I'm really happy to have other people sharing in that.
Absolutely. Beth, you had some other questions too, didn't you?
I have a whole list of them.
Sure, keep going.
Okay, when you were talking about the Pentateuch, one of the points that you made was that there's no Moses before the exile. And one of the things that you cited were the writings of the prophets. Why is this important?
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Part where my eyes bugged out. Yeah, the judges, and so it would be before the 8th century. Now, this tale supposedly took place in, well, that's a problem too, because you have everything from 1980 BCE to 1290 BCE. There's a whole range of dates where people have placed the Exodus and Moses' period. And I go into that detail about that as well, where there's a number of different times of different people. Oh, 51 lawgivers. Is that what you were talking about? 52 lawgivers. Okay, that's what you're talking about. All right. You mean that whole list? That's what you were saying.
That would, yes.
I get it. Okay. So, I've just been reminded of that. Yes, there's a whole list of 52 lawgivers. But no, I wasn't claiming that all of their tales were incorporated into it. That was just a list to show you that there were so many different lawgivers, because people tend to think that there's only been one lawgiver in the whole history of the world, and it was Moses.
Yeah.
And then we get dunned by movies every couple of years that reinforce that fallacious belief. So anyway, back to what I was saying, which was about before I got so rudely interrupted. No, I'm kidding. I forget what I was. Where were we going?
I was asking you about the prophets.
Oh, yeah.
Not citing Moses.
The post-exilic, now the exile refers to the Babylonian period in the 6th century, when supposedly Jews were all abducted basically and held captive in Babylon. There's some disputing how captive many of them were actually, because they seem to have been just kind of sitting around raiding the Babylonian libraries and studying with the priesthoods there. So, and that is where a lot of the influences in the Bible come from, in that post-exilic period. But prior to that, you find almost nothing in these older texts that purport to have been composed during the time of the judges, 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th century. If those writings are genuinely old, they wouldn't actually, there's no real record of them having been written down, but a lot of these stories could have been told orally for centuries and elaborated upon and made more sophisticated as the years went on. But in those supposedly earlier texts, there is no real presence of Moses, and what is there could easily have been interpolated as these centuries went on. So it appears that his mythology started to be, as a human patriarch, started to be formulated after the middle of the first millennium, which would be long after his supposed historic presence. I'll give you an example of an old text that was probably an oral tradition, but it's believed to be possibly from the 10th century, and that would be the Song of the Sea, or Exodus 1b to 18, Exodus 15, 1b to 18. That has a tale of this battle between God and the sea, and this is like the core myth that we find paralleled in the Ugaritic texts with Baal versus the sea, Baal being a Canaanite god of great importance. And you can see that this story that they're recounting, where he's battling, that it doesn't require any Moses at all, and this is the Song of the Sea is supposed to be about crossing the Red Sea and parting it and fighting it, and the battle with the Pharaoh, who's a dragon, and blah blah blah. But there's no Moses necessary for any of it. Mm-hmm. It's all about Yahweh,
right?
And indeed, Moses is only mentioned in Exodus 15:1a, which is right at the beginning, and obviously had just been appended to this older core story. So you take an older core story like that, and then you start embellishing it, and they added after that, Exodus 15:19, and so on. They added the story of Miriam, and it's obviously been embellished. And that's how this tale was created. So, they're in Babylon, they're getting influenced by a very immensely popular story of the Epic of Gilgamesh that had been around that region for since the 3rd millennium. At first it had been with the Sumerians, and then the Babylonians Babylonianized it, and then it moved around, and you can find there were texts. There have been many copies of it found. It was hugely popular, and this idea that the Moses myth drew attributes from Gilgamesh is essentially proved by the Arabic tales about Moses, which use blatant attributes from the Epic of Gilgamesh to flesh out the later Islamic tales of Moses. So that's all in my book.
I found your bit about the Pharaoh being the dragon very interesting as well. We think of him as, just nasty old Pharaoh, but the dragon thing really puts a different spin on it.
Yes, again, that element, of course, I fell off the chair when that started to fall into place, but that element of this is kind of why we need context, why people need to study the region of where they're looking for answers, and the history of it, and it needs to be fleshed out as much as possible. You can't just satisfy yourself with some sketchy summary that may be biased and ignoring important details. This myth of the battle between the god and the sea, or the monster of the sea, the Leviathan, the dragon of the deep, the abyss, is extremely important in the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly along the coastline. One can figure out why. If we start realizing that many of these myths have their origin in nature, observations of our natural world, including the sun, the moon, the stars, planets, constellations, wind, water, sea, river, wine. If you start to look at the world in those terms, you got to turn off the TV in your brain. You got to turn off the electricity. You got to turn off all the modern conveniences and look at your surroundings and realize that people were very involved in the natural world back then. Then all of these stories start to make sense. The people who were in the Eastern Mediterranean, and are even further with the Phoenicians because they sailed around the Mediterranean quite extensively. The Phoenicians, for example, were highly influential. The earlier, before they were called Phoenicians, the earlier culture along the same kind of Ugaritic region, these Semitic peoples along the coastline there, had been engaged in commerce all around that region, including into Egypt. They provided, with those massive cedars of Lebanon, they provided the wood for temple building in Egypt. That's where they got it from. So they were extremely involved with each other. They exchanged culture, they exchanged words, they exchanged myths. You find Phoenician adoption of Egyptian gods, and you find Semitic gods in Egypt. And this cultural exchange has been going on for thousands of years before the first millennium. But in that exchange as well, the Egyptians didn't become great seafarers. They used the wood for boats along the Nile, but the Phoenicians certainly did. And they would have developed, the Phoenicians again would be the Canaanites of the northwest coastline there, they developed these tales about the sea monsters, because if you've been on the open sea or some miles from land and the sea's very deep, and back in those days in particular, there were no GPS, there were no cell phones. It's extremely frightening to go down. If your ship goes down, it sinks.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you think about all those old maps from days gone by that said, here be dragons on them. It's very, very same kind of thing.
What,
Exactly.
you mean they weren't dinosaurs?
No, they weren't.
Oh, I thought dinosaurs existed though with man. Sorry, I had to get in.
According to Ken Ham, yes.
Yes. Animals and everything, right? I like this, the Ken Ham School of Stupid. and speaking of Ken Ham, let's take a minute and do this week's creation moment. And then, Beth, I know you have some more questions for DM Murdock, too. So for now, creation moment.
Behold, the atheist's nightmare. A well-made banana is just the right shape for the human mouth. Easy to digest. And it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier.
I choose to believe that the earth is young. When we do that, when we understand that creation is the truth, then we understand where all of our doctrine comes from as well.
I just want to let you know that there actually is a book out there that actually tells us where matter came from. Bill, I do want to say that there is a book out there.
Next time you hear on television somebody say millions of years ago, what's the question we're going to ask them? Were you there? Were you there? Call them up on the telephone and say, excuse me, Mr. TV man, were you there? Only way we could know what happened in the past if someone was there to tell us. That's right, dinosaurs lived beside people. And of course you'll have an evolutionist who'll say, that's not right, dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. What do you ask them? Were you there?
Hello and welcome to this week's Creation Moment. A little slice of creation silliness I get in my email every day, and I'd like to share it with you so that we can all get a taste of just how crazy creation shit is. On today's Creation Moment, our host Ian Taylor talks to us about cuckoo birds. Let's dive in and see what kind of pearl of wisdom Mr. Taylor has for us this week.
You may be aware that the common cuckoo does not feed or raise its own young. Instead, it lays its eggs in the nests of other birds. The adoptive parents feed and raise the young cuckoo as their own until the cuckoo gets larger than the foster parent and flies away without so much as a thank you.
So just how exactly is a bird supposed to thank its foster parent? Bring it some extra worms? I don't know. Okay, Mr. Taylor, what else have you got?
One common adoptive parent for the young cuckoos is the reed warbler, whose behavior pattern is quite different from the cuckoos. For example, reed warbler parents recognize hungry baby birds by their persistent calling. Cuckoos typically lay one egg in an adoptive nest. Once this egg hatches, the young cuckoo throws the reed warbler eggs out of the nest. So how does one little baby cuckoo manage to convince the parent reed warblers that it is half a dozen reed warbler babies needing to be fed? Researchers have finally learned the amazing answer to that question. They say that the baby cuckoo fools its adoptive parents by sounding like as many as 8 baby reed warblers. The act is so convincing that it gets all the food it wants.
Okay, so far so good. Nothing too crazy here. The baby cuckoo is able to mimic the sound of a warbler's babies. Sounds like something that could have evolved through natural selection because, hey, it's only the cuckoo who sounds the most like a warbler who's going to get fed and live to reproduce. Okay, what's next?
Who teaches the baby cuckoo this trick? Certainly not the mother cuckoo, who incidentally misses out on all the fulfillment of family life. The cuckoo reminds us that deceit robs us of good experiences in our lives. That's why it is comforting when our perfect God of truth tells us that he never changes.
I knew it was too good to be true. So they think that someone has to teach the bird how to do this. There is empirical data for something called inherited memory. It comes through genetics. You know, like other birds who remember the migration routes without ever having been there. No one has to teach the birds this stuff. It happens naturally. And then we get to the really silly stuff about missing out on the good things in life through deceit. Are you kidding me? The cuckoo birds don't have to raise their own young. They lay an egg and fuck off. And then the cuckoo baby gets free room and board until it's old enough to tell the other bird to fuck off too. Where's the downside to this? And it's not like the mama cuckoo bird is going to be holding family night with the chicks, you know, board games and home-cooked meal. Birds don't do that. In fact, animals don't do that. So what's she missing out on exactly? Man, these creation guys sure make my head spin. For the prayer this week, of course, we get back to that basic of emotions, guilt. Religion's so good at that. It says, "Forgive me, dear Father, for any deceit in my life, and help me to live a life of truth and honesty." Okay, well, I can get behind being honest, but come on, like going off on any deceit, well, we all tell little white lies from time to time, but there's no need to heap the Jesus guilt on you for it. And it certainly has nothing to do with what was going on with the cuckoo birds. Come on. In fact, I'm not sure what any of this has to do with creationism. But then I don't spend my time doing mental gymnastics either. Anyway, enough of that craziness. That was this week's creation moment.
Well, there you go. Now you have it.
Yeah. I get that stuff sent to me on an email list. I get at least one a day, sometimes two.
Those crazy creationists.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. So, Beth, what have you got for Dia Murdock?
Well, going back to the Moses Snow, pre-captivity evidence, one thing you point out is that there's actually really no archaeological evidence. Are you familiar with the new Timothy Mahoney film, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus?
Yeah. Does that have something to do with David Rohl?
I believe so. I didn't delve too deeply, but from what I can understand from what I've read about it, his premise is basically that we're looking for Moses in the wrong time or place.
That's David Rohl. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he mentions the city of Avaris, which is actually below the city of Ramses. What's your take on that?
Well, I discussed all of that.
Okay, I wasn't sure because, I mean, as I said, the last day and a half I've been kind of I was rushing through it.
Well, it's a very difficult scholarly book that's chock-a-block full of information. I don't even remember half of it. In fact, I was reviewing it myself today. But the city of Avaris and Ramses, Pi Ramses, these are real places, and we do know that fiction is often set in real places, so that really don't demonstrate anything. In fact, the memory of these Pi Ramses was removed from its ancient location. It was moved, and that could have been in the minds of the writers many centuries after Ramses II. So that evidence is not really evidence. And this idea that you can just start fudging dates and so forth is really ridiculous. I'm sorry they felt the need to go that way, because if they had read my book first, they wouldn't have. They would have been like, "Oh, okay." So what we see is that the core Exodus story in Exodus 15 is actually an ancient myth that was embellished over a period of many centuries, and this did not take place in history. No matter how much we try to change the dates and fit this in here and try that and there and this and that, so. As far as I'm concerned, that particular documentary was refuted before it was released.
That's what was the sense that I got trying to figure out if you had mentioned it, is that it didn't really sound like anything new, but it sounded like something that you did refute. So that's
Well,
I
of
was
course,
just wondering.
my entire book refutes it because it shows
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what century you try to shove this into. You can't change it like that because there's still no hardcore physical evidence. The Sinai, for example, had been swept clean by archaeologists for many years, and there still remains no hard evidence for a 40-year period of some 3 million Semites having inhabited any region remotely resembling what is depicted in the Old Testament.
You gotta think, millions of people traipsing around in a relatively small desert for 40 years. You think you'd turn up a bowl or something somewhere.
Okay, speaking of traipsing around, I listened to your discussion with Arn from a couple of weeks ago, and that was a point that I'm not sure if he brought it up or you did, but you guys did discuss is about how many miles did they actually walk in those 40 years?
Yeah, right. Well, as the crow flies, the route that they supposedly would have taken from Egypt to the Levant would be like 130, 140 miles. And so if you had 3 million people all lined up, even, just like 5 across, it was something absurd, like they would cover 1,500 miles. So they would be already in, the front of the line would be well in the new land, promised land, before the back even started moving. So it just is, it's just a ridiculous story. But if you know the context, the mythical context, there's no reason to be doing all these gyrations with fudging numbers and moving centuries and changing date lines. It's well-established date lines, by the way. I'm sure that this particular effort is not well received by Egyptologists, for example. And they would be the people to turn to about this new dating methodology, because I know some of them are infuriated by it and completely reject it.
Well,
so,
I know in one article he said, well, we talked to all these different scholars, and they're ecstatic about yada, yada, yada. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, you've talked to, in my opinion, revisionists, Wolpe being one of them.
Or Christians.
Yes. And there was like... let's see.
Bible thumpers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oops, wrong article.
Well, it was the one that you shared with me. The people you talked to were all like, people who already were drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
Yeah,
so
they want it to be historical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're all, oh, this is awesome, and we knew.
We finally found the biblical story. But this has been going on for centuries, because there was somebody in the 17th century who found this and that place didn't here and there. And it just, when you see these developments over, it's like, oh, another one? Look, instead of trying all this, the frantic antics, give a read of my book, Did Moses Exist? The Myth of the Israelite Lawgiver, and see that what I presented in there actually makes logical sense, fits within the behavior of human beings, and explains practically everything. And when I say the behavior of human beings, this is something, another thing. We rip everything out of context. They don't have the milieu fleshed out. And there's no factoring in mythography. You barely even know that word, because no one talks about mythography, which is the creation of myths. I've been studying myths since I was a child, and in college I spent a lot of time focused on Greek civilization. And, of course, with that are all the great Greek myths, and I lived in Greece, I speak the language, I traveled all over the country, I saw these temples in various states of ruin, had all these amazing stories in my head as I went to Olympus, and I went to Delphi and Olympia, and all these different fabulous places that we read about in these myths, in Greek myths. So once you understand mythology and mythography, which is the creation of myths, how was Hercules created? How was Zeus created? Where did they come from? What do they mean? How do they look over a period of centuries as they're embellished with different attributes and different narratives of myths and tales that they did and motifs? And once you understand mythography, then you can see it when you read a story like the Exodus or the Jesus myth. You can see it, that this is not a historical story. It's certainly not literal because of all the supernaturalism. It's not history mythologized. It's myth historicized.
Oh, I love that point.
That's great.
Yeah, you talk about historicized fiction versus fictional history, and then you went into the archetypical motifs. And this is one of my ready, set, go moments for you, Acharya. And then you get into euhemerism and astrotheology. Take it away.
Yeah, euhemerism comes from the ancient Greek writer Euhemerus, and because it's so difficult to pronounce, I've used a convention that also changed evangelical to evangelical, and we call it evemerism for pronunciation's sake. So evemerism is the idea that ancient kings, queens, heroes, and legends were all real people to whose mundane biographies were added supernatural fairy tales and fabulous and magical details. So that idea, they've taken a real person and turned him or her into a god, deity. That's called evemerism. And what we're espousing here is Moses mythicism, Jesus mythicism, which is somewhat the opposite of evemerism. It's saying, no, they've taken a myth and turned it into a person, not taken a person and turned it into a myth. And this mythicism is provable, demonstrable, abundantly through studying pre-Christian, pre-biblical, pre-Mosaic mythology. And you can find that we're fortunate enough that the people of the Levant, the Near East, into the Mesopotamian region and Egypt, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Eblites, the Ugarites, the people of Mari, that they left a very profound historical record in all of these thousands and thousands of clay tablets that are inscribed with cuneiform, and of course all the hieroglyphs that are carved all over, and then the papyri from Egypt. That there is a very substantial amount of information about pre-biblical mythology from that region. And then of course there's the Greek myths that have been recorded for hundreds of years orally with the various Homeric, Iliad and Odyssey texts that were told for centuries orally. So we know a substantial amount about mythology. And if you start looking into these primary sources from antiquity, you can see these different motifs. The motif of the God, the Father, with the Virgin Mother, and the Son of God. You can find that in Canaanite mythology, dating to about 1200 BCE. The Savior, the Healer, again, the Son of God, the Great Divine Lawgiver. These are all motifs that you can find associated with deities in this particular Eastern Mediterranean region. And once you know that, there's almost nothing left in the Moses story or the Jesus stories that needs to have any kind of historical person attached to it. There's no historical core to this onion once the mythological layers are removed. And that, again, you can only see that truism clearly if you actually study these subjects. But if you just rip it all out of context and it's in a void, then you might you might be suspicious that at least the supernatural parts are not real. As we get increasingly rational and scientific, we don't start not to believe that stuff. But then you start thinking, well, in the case of, let's say, Moses, there could have been a guy who was a lawgiver, and there could have been a group of people of a smaller amount that left Egypt, and there could have been this and that. But the thing is, it's not necessary for the story, and there is no evidence for that. As far as exoduses go, I also point out in my book that this is a major passageway from Africa to the rest of the world. That Sinai region, the desert crossing right there, the Red Sea, all along the Red Sea. They can cross the Red Sea with boats. There are some places that are fairly shallow. There's the Reed Sea up at the north. There's sailing around the tip of it. But in any event, people have been crossing that region for tens of thousands of years. And if you subscribe to the out of Africa DNA theory, which is some people do not, but it's a favored one within the mainstream, then 70,000 years ago, humans started leaving Africa. The Israelis claim to have teeth of 400,000 year old Homo sapiens. So if they were from Africa, they left 400,000 years ago, or maybe more, 500,000 years ago. But the standard paradigm right now is saying 70,000 years ago, people started leaving Africa, going along the coastline, which was different than it is now. They end up in Australia and other parts up into India, and then from India spreading out all over the world. That's one idea. But that would mean then during that period, there were thousands of crossings of the Sinai. Up along the coast or down along the southern region and crossing the Red Sea. So if you say there was some guy and he led some people, well, yeah, there were probably 10,000 guys leading 10,000 groups of people. So which one is it? It's not their story being told in the Bible. Because we also know from the Dionysian myth that he flees into the Red Sea. And so, this was a common motif, mythical motif in antiquity. Dionysus has been associated with Osiris since Herodotus in the 5th century, so BC. And that, I'm sure he was associated with Osiris for much longer than that because of the whole wine aspect. They're both lords of the wine, and Osiris or Dionysus fleeing into the Red Sea. That would be a common way of leaving Egypt. So, and crossing the Sinai would be a common way of leaving. So, if Osiris's wine cult, is leaving Egypt, then that's the way it would go. And there's another guy who's leaving Egypt with a group of people, or whether they're mythical or not, leaving the gods out of Egypt. So there are many, many exoduses out of Egypt, but it's not a historical tale being told in the Moses story.
We do have a question from chat, which kind of ties into what you're talking about as far as the Egyptian and Greek mythology. Which came first, Egypt mythology or Greek?
Well, Egyptian culture is much older than the Greek. The Greek, we start getting inferences of Greek gods in the latter half of the 2nd millennium, and that would be 1300 BCE when Dionysus's name shows up first in the extant historical record. Of course, that's just what we have, and that there's been a massive amount of destruction. But you find his name at Pylos in Greece, where I've been, and it was a long time ago. But I love these, and all these pieces of puzzle fit into place. It's kind of exciting. But of course, then the Egyptian culture is 5,000 years old at least. Their own tales said Osiris was 10,000 years old, and then some of that mythology is traceable possibly to Africa as well, so it would be older still. But with the Dionysian mythology in particular, I would imagine that it is the core or the beginnings of it would accompany the cultivation of grapes, and especially the fabrication of wine, so winemaking. And you find there's been winemaking on the planet for 5,000, depends on where you are, different years in different places. And so elements of that wine mythology might date back 5, 6, 7,000 years, maybe more.
And I'm enjoying some right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't that what you're drinking there, heretic?
She's a heretic. Well, you know, that wine mythology was quite astonishing to unravel as well. There's a whole section of wine discussion in my book, and I've considered making it into a separate book to sell to have wineries sell it, and as a history of not wine making specifically, but wine mythology, because it's one of those unfactored elements in these tales that you don't even consider how influential the wine cult was in the Mediterranean for thousands of years. It was massively important, not just for getting people drunk, but economically.
Oh, yeah.
This was a huge industry.
Well, when you think about it, water was not necessarily safe to drink, so doing things like creating wine in that region, ale in European region makes more sense, because that's how it was safe to, drink fluid.
Oh, absolutely. And then there was the very strange beer that was made in Egypt, and there's a whole Assyrian Eucharistic ritual of the beer and the bread, like the wine and the bread in a sort of later era probably, but the beer was this really thick porridge that had medicinal purposes because it had a sort of penicillin growing in it.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And so there was reason to be drinking that beer too, for reasons it would destroy the bacteria in the water, and they didn't have great water purification systems set up. The water could be fouled. That happened in the Americas when the Europeans landed here. Of course, there was a big problem with the water, and they wanted to drink beer. And even the children had to drink beer. But wine. I mean, you can also imagine, because it has this ability to take away your woes and to make you sleepy, that it was considered very medicinal. And there's a big controversy there that you get into with the implementation of the wine cult in the Dionysian myths. If you did not accept the wine cult in your region, in the stories that are told, say by the various poets who sang the myths of Dionysus, you would be killed. And basically what they're saying is, this is a racket, you're going to let us in, we're going to move in on your territory, and we're going to create this wine industry, or else you're going to get killed if you resist us. That's the tale of Pentheus being ripped apart, and the other gods, the other kings being killed. And the objections to the drinking, there's a story where the first vintner is killed by the mob because he's accused of poisoning the people, because they were like, whoa, what is this? And you can tell these are actual possible occurrences, at least at one point, that were woven into myths for purposes of teaching lessons and also spreading the wine cult.
That makes sense. It's like, don't mess with the wine, or you're in trouble.
Yeah,
don't mess with the Bible, or you're in trouble.
Well, it's a monetary thing. You don't mess with the mob's income, or they're gonna knock you off.
You're gonna drink our wine, and you're gonna like it.
Ooh, yeah.
So the cult of the wine god is everywhere present, and indeed in the Levant, where the Moses myths would have been told, would have arisen, we find that one of the major kings, Hezekiah, supposedly living in the 8th century, the great reformer king who introduces Yahwism with a fury, and they've found wine, that he had wineries, vineyards, and they found wine seals from jars with his name on them, and so these great empires, the individuals were able to acquire, being kings and whatnot. It was intertwined with the wealth that they received from commerce, obviously, and in the case of wine, we see it right there in the Levant, and we knew that the tribes that emerged from the hills, the Israelites, that they grew grapes and they created wine, and then there were vineyards in Egypt. Really fascinating. The Egyptians, they're called like the House of Horus or something like that. They're different names we find in the ancient texts about wine, and so it would not surprise us that the great wine god who eventually was developed, is called Dionysus, that his attributes would creep into the stories of other cultures. In fact, it makes perfect sense. And if you realize that Dionysus is present in the Levant at the latest, the 13th century, the Greeks were present, I should say, in the Levant in the 13th century BCE, that they certainly could have started having an influence on people then, and being influenced by different mythology and religion and rituals that were already there. The wine cult became very big, and in fact, in the Ugaritic text, there's a legal code was found that dates to about the 13th century BCE, and is called Els Marzia, which is his wine banquet, and El is the great high god. And so there's a whole law code associated with wine and the high god, and these are really the most direct predecessors of the Western Israelites, Northwestern Israelites in particular. And so that had to be part of their culture because El prevails, Israel.
Yep.
And El's legal code was intertwined with wine. They have stories of great goblets of wine, which are very reminiscent of the story of Cana, where Jesus makes...
Yeah.
And he turns water into wine, and also the chalice, the Holy Grail. That's an old story. Pre-Christian.
I think wine's prettier. I don't know.
That's a great looking Grail. Yeah, you know that the whole female goddess worshipping cultures, that would be the womb, and the wine is symbolic of menstrual blood, which in goddess regions was, of course, rightly attributed to producing life. And so you have that going on too with this, and the coloring of it, the blood red wine, and it's,
this is a Zinfandel, but it's blush.
I'm a little jealous. I don't have any wine here.
Well, one of our chatters put in Chateau Horace.
Yeah.
Like that.
I can't. I'd have to look it up. This is one of those details that I don't have off the top of my head. But there was the vineyards of Horace had some elegant name. But that reminded me though that when we were talking about the law of wine and Els Marzia, which is a wine banquet that resembles what the Greeks eventually made infamous, where they would lie around on their couches and fling wine against the wall and get plastered, and then the Romans took it even further. They would be vomiting and until they were unconscious and all that. But this banquet and the law. We were talking about the various lawgivers. Dionysus was also considered a lawgiver, and in the ancient world, even in the first couple centuries before the Common Era, the commonalities between Moses and Dionysus were being noticed, and there is testimony that puts the two together in comparisons between lawgivers. There's also this incredibly fascinating information that we find in Plutarch from the 2nd century AD CE, Common Era, where he's recounting the fall festivals of the Jews, and especially the wine harvest, and he states outright that their god is Dionysus, and that they're doing Dionysian rituals, the Jews, that is. And so that testimony from antiquity is very, very interesting. We find also, to validate that, in houses of blatantly, obviously wealthy people in Israel, there have been found mosaics of Dionysus on the floor and other Greek gods. But there's a great deal of evidence about the Dionysian connection to the Jewish texts and rituals and myths. Very interesting.
That's fascinating. I was able to go to a recreation of a Bacchanalia a few years ago. That was fun.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Well, I lived in Greece, and I was over there when I would be underage here, but there was no drinking age there. And we went to this wine festival at Daphnina, which is near Athens. It's very famous. Mm-hmm. And so there was, these teenage girls drinking wine. It was quite an interesting experience, to say the least. A lot of fun.
I used to belong to a historical recreation group called the Society for Creative Anachronism, if you ever heard of it. And this was a weekend event, and they did a Bacchanalia, and they even had a guy dressed up as Pan, like with the whole furry legs and the whole 9 yards, and it was and it was for ladies mainly, so any of the guys who were there were to be getting us drinks and, offering to rub our feet and fun stuff like that. So
well, eventually the Bacchanalia were outlawed because they were too depraved, apparently, but the emperors in the Roman period kind of went back and forth on these different mystery groups. They were like, one emperor would outlaw them, and the next one come along and make them legal again, and they couldn't make up their mind whether they should
I guess
get rid of them.
The preference of the individual emperor, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what you find in the. We're still talking about the first millennium. In the Jewish or Israelite history, you have these reformer kings, Josiah and Hezekiah, who are just really violent, and they're rampaging and destroying the high places, and the rampant Canaanite religion that was being practiced by the Israelites all over the place at that supposedly late date. And then, oddly enough, you find then in papyri from Elephantine Egypt from the 5th century that Yahweh is being worshipped, or Yahu is being worshipped alongside Anat, who's essentially a virgin goddess.
Right.
And so they're polytheistic, and then you find out that even well into the Common Era, the Jews are incorporating Zeus into and Dionysus and Hercules. They're all on these mosaics. And so this impression that we get from the Yahwistic texts in the Bible, which have been reworked from this perspective of an intolerant monotheism under one God, Yahweh, one tribal God, Yahweh, that impression is erroneous, that there was always a significant amount of Jews or Samaritans, Israelites, who were polytheistic, and they stayed polytheistic, and it was almost like these reformer kings and Yahweh fanatics were just a kind of a pest. They were like, okay, get out of here, move along. Next we go back to our polytheism, and then they come along again, and they're like, rah, rah, rah. And then the people either get rid of them or somehow they disappear or whatever, and the people go back to the same practices over and over again. They'll adopt the gods of other cultures, and they're really not that different from the Canaanites from whom they merged, or the Greeks. They became very Hellenized.
If you pay attention to the verbiage in the Old Testament, you can see where there's references to there being multiple gods that eradicate that in an effective manner. And if you know your language and if you know what to look for, you can be like, hey, wait a minute, that's referring to a different god than Yahweh.
Yes. That's right, all the L's, Elohim. The Ugaritic texts really opened all that up. They're fascinating. You can see all these different deities under the 70 Elohim. There's the sons of El, and Baal is in there. So then you start seeing that going on. There's let's see, the El ending suffix like Gabriel and Michael and all that. Those are probably all gods, ancient gods as well. There's the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub, and just a whole wide variety of god names.
It always struck out to me that in what we consider to be the Ten Commandments, they say you'll have no other gods before me, and I'm like, what other god would you be?
Well, and that ties in too. If you look at Leviticus, especially chapter 17 through 26. To hit a little politics here, with the anti-LGBT community, where they use the two clobber passages from Leviticus, but what they ignore is the context of those passages, and the fact that if you look at the Holiness Code, that whole section is talking about being separated from the pagan cultures, the other gods. And they totally ignore that.
Yeah, it's really quite supremacist and very derogatory towards everyone else's deities. And what it turns out to be is just like a handful of fanatics, like we see in the world today, a handful of intolerant fanatics who want to impose their fanaticism upon everyone else, and the others are resisting it, and so there's constant killing. And this was supposed to be the story that why Moses took these 3 million people into the desert for 40 years was so he could relentlessly brainwash them to accept the law. And through deprivation and torture, starvation, thirst, and hard desert living. And during that time, this cult leader is supposedly getting visited by the god of the cosmos, who's popping to Earth to not visit the pyramids, not check out the great cultures and civilizations in any part, but to visit a tent in the desert.
I love that when you're talking about the wee little tent, and
Yes, it's a wee little tent. It really is.
This big, I'm the god of the universe, but I'm gonna go hang out in this tiny little tent.
I know. And he tells him, like, don't come near this patch of dirt I'm on because you'll sully it. It's like, what the? And then to Aaron, there's only 4 people who are involved in the priesthood at that point. It's Moses, Aaron, his 2 sons, and God strikes the sons dead. So that was like, well, I'm sick of you. But
oh my gosh, I'm like, what? They used the wrong fire, and he's just like, yeah. Like, holy crap!
I know, and then you're supposed to believe that while they're in the desert and they've got no wood and they really are starving for food, so much so that they have to eat manna, which is, what is it? That's what manna really means. Like, what is manna? But that God is giving them detailed instructions over and over and over again how to immolate, which means burn, offerings to him. So they have to constantly find all of these birds and other creatures to burn to Yahweh while the people are eating manna. And where are they getting the wood from to be doing all of this burning?
Can you imagine the stench?
Well, the stench was pleasing to the Lord's nostrils.
Yeah, but ugh.
Well, it's a ridiculous proposition because you're having these stacks of burnt wood and ashes and dead bodies and feathers and bones, and you're having to spend all your time doing this and then removing all of that trash, and then you have to do it again. That's what God wants His chosen people to be occupied with constantly, and they're not even getting to eat this.
I know.
So it's absolutely ludicrous.
If you look at the pictures from that Tibetan Hindu ceremony that happened,
the Nepalese, yes.
Yes, that's right, the Nepalese, and there's just as far as the eye can see, dead animals.
Yeah.
And you imagine that in the desert.
Yeah.
Ugh.
It's just
where do you move it to?
What did I have a figure of that the amount of they're talking about quail, that God sent quail to feed them. What was that number? It was like 250 million quail supposedly would have plopped down in the midst of these people to feed them. Just the numbers alone for what was required to have a historical exodus and 40-year sojourn are just ridiculous.
What I thought was funny was how it was Aaron and his sons who got to eat all the good meat,
They must have been very fat.
No kidding. Like, they're in the desert, everyone else is, wasting away, and there's these big fat priest guys walking around because they get to eat all the meat. Like,
children starving, and then there was the magical clothes. The clothes grew with the people, and then they would recycle the children, and then they would grow with the children and recycle.
That's it.
The first part of my book, it deals with the historicity and shows how it's completely unscientific. And then once we've determined that it's non-historical, the Exodus of Moses' story, the entry into the Promised Land. Once we've determined that it could not have happened in history, then we go into where did it come from, and then I go into the mythology of it. That's how the book is structured. So there's a significant amount of dissection of the historical claims using scientific analyses.
Mm-hmm. I love the part, too, where you're like, there were already Egyptians in the Promised Land. It was empty, people.
That was really the most ridiculous anachronism of the entire tale. They can't escape the Egyptians by going to the Levant because the Egyptians were already ruling the area and had been going in and out of it for centuries at that point. In fact, in the pre-Israelite Jerusalem, city of Jerusalem, which is called Jebus or Jebus, and the Jebusites lived there, and those are part of the great Amoritish migrations. They found Egyptian artifacts and a temple of Osiris. So, to escape to Jerusalem, to escape to Egypt, you'd still be ending up in Egypt, basically.
That's like the ultimate out of the frying pan into the fire story.
Well, there's the thing, too, that the people who are writing this story obviously didn't know. It's so anachronistic. They're writing it centuries later when that had ended. Egypt had, its glory days were over, and they were no longer ruling over the Canaanite regions, or even necessarily having much cultural exchange, and so they didn't have these fortresses all along the coast of the Mediterranean like they did the Horus Way, it was called, and so because the story doesn't even recognize that these way stations are there, that they would have encountered, even if they tried to escape that way, they would have run into garrisons of Egyptians. So they'd be running right towards them, more garrisons blocking their way, and it just it's so anachronistic. You can't even.
Silly.
I mean, you have to in order to change the chronology to fit the tale, you'd have to move it into the first millennium. So how far are you going to bend that?
Exactly. I have a question from the Q&A section, and the question is, where does the 3 million people come from? Says they are having a hard time finding a reference for that.
Well, that's an extrapolation for the 600,000 fighting men that is mentioned in the Bible.
Okay.
And that number 600,000, by the way, I go into some detail about that too is quite likely, well, it's obviously not a historical figure because it didn't happen, but that you can find that in like Kabbalah. It's kind of a magical number. But so the Bible does mention the 600,000 fighting men. It may say 611,000 or whatever in a different place, but that's basically what they've glommed onto, 600K. And then they would have wives, so that would be 1.2 million, and then they would have children, and then oddly, so the estimate would be 2 to 3 million Hebrews. Okay. But nobody mentions that they had slaves of their own, and so they're factored into it too. The Hebrews had their own slaves.
You could be looking at upwards of 5 million people.
Yeah. Well, I think they're factoring in the slaves. Maybe they had 250,000 slaves. But then there's also all the animals they supposedly took with them, which would be another 250,000 possibly. And
and not a single bowl or a single, a fire pit or anything out in. And it's, my understanding is it's not that big of a desert either.
No, we're saying it's only 130 miles as the crow flies across. So
okay, that's like, I mean, I'm in Canada, so that would be like a little farther than me going to Toronto.
Yeah, and you try to fit 3 million people in a line across there.
No way! There is no way I could get lost for 40 years trying to find my way past Toronto.
It actually says the reason that they were in the desert, though, for that length of time. They could have found their way, but they had to stay there because they were stiff-necked and they had to be abused into a cult. That's basically what...
Oh, I realize that, but it's just ridiculous. I mean, you think somebody, like, hey, look, there's the way to the desert. Shut up and keep walking,
Well, then you're also supposed to believe that you have 600,000 fighting men, which is a very significant army, but they're terrified of going along the coast because, well, they're like the Philistines are there, but there's another anachronism because the Philistines didn't even exist until 100 years or more later, depending on which of the many dates you ascribe Moses' period to. But so they're terrified of them and the Amalekites and. They have this huge amount of people. Yeah, right, the Nephilim. They have this huge amount of people. Oh, and I love that. There's so many Nephilim, but we've never found any skeletons of all these giants that are all over.
When I read that today, I'm into the Nephilim thing. Not that I believe in it, but it's something I've been studying now, going on 4 years. Yes, and when I read it, I messaged them and I said, "You're not going to believe what she brings up in her book."
Yeah, you probably laughed at the notion.
I was like, and I glommed over it because it was just like, because I knew if I actually really seriously, I'd still be off in my gopher hole somewhere.
Yeah, giants in the Promised Land, Numbers 13:33. The Bible contends the Israelites were terrified of Nephilim, or giants occupying the Promised Land, suggested as one reason the chosen sojourned for so long in the Sinai. These Nephilim are mentioned also in Genesis as the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. We need to ask why the all-powerful Yahweh could not rid Israel of the giants, but instead made millions of people suffer in the desert for 40 years.
Yeah.
Well,
additionally, if there were so many giants, where are there tens of thousands of remains, all dating to the second millennium BCE?
And if you actually had an illustration in your book, if I remember correctly, it was Og on the unicorn. And if you think about it, if you follow the Nephilim,
mythology.
yes, the mythology behind it, if you follow some of the proponents of them, what they propose is that whole scenario with Og on a unicorn, and that's how the giants reappeared after the flood. I saw that illustration and I about busted a gut because it doesn't matter what book. I mean, it always pops up, and it's been like that for going on almost 5 years now. This is how long I've been
Well, the Nephilim are haunting you, are they?
Yeah, but
did you read my analysis of them as being stars and not real people?
No, because I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole because I'd still be there, and we would not be on air right now because you had also written something too on your website concerning the ancient alien hypothesis.
Yes,
so I want to really read it, and because reading your writing makes me think in a different way.
It does.
So, yeah, I didn't really read tight into it, so.
Let me read this very brief section on the. Well, there's more to it, but I'll read the first part of it. The mythical giants. Although some of the taller local tribes, such as the Amalekites, have been lighted upon in order to bring realism to the story, the Exodus giants or Nephilim tale represents not history, but an astral or astrotheological motif. In Aramaic, the word Nephilah refers to the constellation of Orion. The giant hunter in the sky plays an important role in Egyptian religion, among many others. And so I give the different words in Akkadian and Chaldean, and the Nephila means giant in the sky, and it refers to the constellation of Orion. That's in the Akkadian. And then the Semitic term used for Orion is Jibaur, which means strong man or giant.
Yes.
El-Jabbar, Abdul-Jabbar. And then talking about the sons of God in Ugaritic mythology, I go on about that as well. So once you put that, again, in the context of the surrounding cultures, like Orion, the Orion studies, and then the Ugaritic stories of the sons of God, then it all starts to make sense mythically.
Yeah, I had done a post going back probably 4 years, and one of the, I'll say researchers, for lack of a better word, had brought up the Orion constellation, and so now I'm going to have to go back and revamp that one because you're the second person that's actually brought it up, and I thought it was kind of out there, but now, I mean, being more familiar with your work, I can see where he was going. He takes it off on a really wacky tangent, though.
Sure.
But it just, oh boy. See, this is why I didn't read your stat section.
Yeah, well, it all starts to make sense because we're talking about cultures that lived in hot desert regions, in this instance, Arabia and the Semitic regions, and they would be very in tune with the night sky in particular. Mm-hmm. And so
you brought that up in a previous interview about, they didn't have TV and internet.
Right. Their stories would be told about their natural surroundings and their interaction with them, and also in order to pass along information to the next generation of, let's say, the nomads who are wandering, and they wander by the night sky, they need their visual landmarks to tell them where they're going. Where's the next village? Where's the next well? Where's the next oasis? And so they would use the landmarks, the stellar landmarks. The phases of the moon become very important, which is why we have lunar calendars more popular in Arabia and also in different parts of the Levant where the Israelites were, where they emerged. But they're not just a lunar culture. They also have a lot of solar elements to them. The sun in very hot desert regions would be less of a benevolent deity and more of a pestilence, because it's burning everything and destroying the crops and torturing you in the day. And so that's where you start to see how the myths are developed. But you really have to get away from this idea that we're raised that the sun is just a big ball of gas, and that the stars are really very far away, and that these are scientific perceptions, but they're not what the ancients would be seeing. And so we have to take our mind back to that era, and it's not necessarily more primitive. I would say it's more innocent, so that they see the stars and they think that these are living beings.
Right.
And the sun is conscious, and there's still many people who are sun worshippers in Hinduism, for example, and there's a lot of people who continue to project consciousness onto the sun and believe that it's a proxy of deity. But that idea was extremely prevalent in antiquity, and the moon, of course, and it came from a sense of wonder that we've lost through our reductionism of these are all just mechanical balls of gas, and they have no consciousness and no personality. But these myths are not just fantasy that people believe the sun was a real person. They also incorporate movements and characteristics of the sun, the moon, the stars, Venus, that are useful scientific observations. For example, when the star Sirius is rising heliacally, which means with the sun, in the early summer, or rather around the summer solstice in the next few weeks after that, along the Nile, it means the Nile is going to flood. And so knowing that, the people were able to prepare for the flooding of the Nile, which was extremely crucial to the continuation of their culture and their civilization. And without that knowledge, you wouldn't have the great civilization of Egypt. And so they saw that configuration as being divinely appointed. They would notice, okay, here comes Sirius, and Sirius then is both Osiris and, in other myths, Isis, but in that particular myth, it's the birth of Osiris, who is their savior. Osiris is the sharp star Sirius, who impregnates Isis, and by the river overflowing the banks of the Nile, and then the product of that is the foliage that is Horus. And so that foliage, being wheat, will feed the people and the animals, and it brings life. And so the Savior brings life through the impregnation of the virginal birth, of the virginal banks. This is just one of these types of myths. And this is why Osiris is depicted as green, because he represents foliage, chlorophyll, photosynthesis.
Makes sense.
They all start making sense like that when you understand the nature worshipping basis of them. Fascinating.
I could tell you as a ginger, the sun is a cruel and torturous bastard.
I have.
If you were in Ireland, where it's often gloomy and the sun is not real visible in the winter time and it's cold, then you'd probably want the sun to come back. That's where all the Yuletide celebrations, where they're so,
I can tell you 10 minutes in the summer and I start to look like a monster. So
you need astaxanthin. You got to take that. That'll help. Yeah, astaxanthin helps minimize sensitivity to the sun. It's the dye that develops in flamingos. Pink flamingos are born white.
That's right.
They turn pink from eating the algae, or is it an algae or crustaceans? But it's pink, and that dye that turns them. That's astaxanthin, and you actually can ingest that, and it'll reduce your sensitivity to the sun. Get rid of sunburns too.
I need to look into that because we
follow the instructions. Consult your physician.
Right now, I use 60 SPF, so.
Yeah, I would do astaxanthin. Anyway, there's another little natural world thing here.
Awesome. Let's take Oh, hang on.
Oh, no, go ahead.
And do the logical fallacy, and then when we come back, you can you can hit Acharya with your next question. How's that?
Yeah, I have 2 from chat.
Awesome. Well, let's do the logical fallacy. And it's time for logical fallacies for dummies. And welcome to this week's Logical Fallacy for Dummies. This week, I'd like to talk about one of the most common logical fallacies that you're going to come across in debate and discussion, the straw man fallacy. What's a straw man? Well, a straw man occurs when your opponent misrepresents what your position or argument actually is in order to make your position seem weaker, and then generally they'll go ahead and claim that they have been able to refute you. Problem is, what they may have refuted usually isn't what your stated position was in the first place. This happens in almost every debate or discussion that I've come across. And sometimes it can even happen by accident. If the person that you are debating doesn't actually understand your position, they could come back with a straw man argument, not realizing that they are indeed misrepresenting your position. In order to illustrate the straw man fallacy, I found a nice clip of Richard Dawkins at a debate with a gentleman named Lennox. Richard Dawkins is discussing several straw man fallacies that have been presented to him at this point in the discussion. He illustrates why they're straw man fallacies and presents the counterpoint as to what the real argument ought to be.
Now, John used the illustration of an archaeologist, wasn't it, who found some scratches on a cave. And it was supposed to be a powerful argument that said, well, these scratches are very simple, but the person who did the scratching was complex. That's nothing to do with the argument I'm putting. The argument I'm putting is that if we're trying to explain complexity, we need some kind of an ultimate explanation for the existence of a complex object, an improbable object. Certainly, the scratches on the cave are simple, and certainly the human that made those scratches is complex. If you went to another planet and you found some scratches which indicated the existence of life, we would both postulate the existence of a complex living being. But we would both need an explanation for where that complex living being came from. And I put it to you that just to say it was always there, or it just happened, is precisely the kind of non-explanation which creationists accuse evolutionists of erecting. They say, how could an eye come about by sheer chance? Well, of course an eye couldn't come about by sheer chance. It has to come about by a gradual, incremental process from simple beginnings. Exactly the same is true of anything complex. And that God, you can't just duck the issue, you can't just evade the issue by saying God was always there. You still need an explanation. So it tells you nothing to say that the scratches on the wall are simple. And by the way, the idea that physics is complex because it's difficult, that's a confusion of the two meanings of the word simple. Simple meaning easy to understand, and certainly modern physics isn't easy to understand, but there is a sense in which it's simple in the way that biology isn't.
So we see here Dawkins is presenting 3 main arguments. The first is that Lennox has misconstrued the position, stating that, with an example, complex items or people can do simple tasks. But that's not what the discussion is about. What Dawkins' point is, complex things need an origin, and that God must also have an origin. Just because he is complex does not mean he doesn't need an origin. The second point that Dawkins makes, and is one that I have encountered many, many times when dealing with people trying to purport intelligent design, is that the eye cannot come by chance. It's too complex. But that's not what the argument is. The argument is that the eye has evolved from a simple item through a gradual incremental process into something much more complex than it is today. So we're not saying that, an eye randomly came into existence as a complex item. What we're saying is that it evolved. The third argument that Dawkins is making is that physics is often misconstrued as being complex because it is difficult. What he states, though, is that there are areas of physics that are quite simplistic in comparison to something like biology, and that by no means means that it is easy to do or to understand, but the process still can be simplistic. So this is a good example of how a straw man can be used to obfuscate the argument, especially the eye one. That's one that, as I say, I've dealt with on many occasions. There's nothing to say that the eye is too complex to have evolved. Nothing. And it has nothing to do with random chance. Natural selection is very much not random. So this gives you a good idea of how people use the straw man in order to try to gain an upper hand in an argument. Just be very cognizant of what others' arguments are and try not to fall into that trap yourself. As I say, if you don't understand your opponent's position, it is easy to go ahead and present a straw man with no intention of doing so. And just be aware of how your opponent is summarizing your own position so that you can negate any straw man that they may have presented. And that concludes this week's Logical Fallacies for Dummies.
Yes, you made a very good point at the end there.
Thank you.
Yes, well done.
Because a lot of people don't realize, which a lot of the apologists do, and it doesn't necessarily mean Christian apologists. Anybody that's defending their point of view is that they'll take your view, totally twist it, and I know Acharya is very well aware of this.
Oh, yes.
And twist it into something it is not, and then they attack that. And they're not even attacking your position. So, yeah, that was a good point, and it ties in very well.
Thank you. So let's get to that question from chat, because we're coming up on 20 after, and we're going to have to wrap up soon.
Okay, well, first there's a comment in our Q&A, and this is from Pero1. It's not necessarily a question, just a statement of thank you. Thank you, because, damn, I'm learning a lot and on how the whole mess of current religion and its interpretations got so messed up and convoluted.
Thank you.
Awesome. You're welcome.
And it's like he or she is a fellow Canadian, so hello. Thanks for dropping by and watching. Awesome.
Yes.
So
and then,
yep.
I think this is a two-part question, so I'm going to read them both together, and I'm echoing.
Okay.
There we go. Who do you prefer as the more historically correct Moses? Charlton Heston or Christian Bale? Okay, and then the I'm going to say second part is concerning battlefield myths. Are they a useful tool by aspiring theologians and charismatic individuals to popularize a newer religion? Even in modern films, it's always a crowd pleaser.
Wow. Well, as far as the first one goes, I haven't seen the Christian Bale film, but I do understand that he said Moses was a psychopath or something. So I think I prefer his lack of piety to that of Charlton Heston. But I actually met Charlton Heston in Hollywood at the old Charlie Chaplin mansion during a fundraiser, and yeah, he was a pretty extraordinary human being. I only briefly said hello to him, but so I have to favor Charlton Heston for his Moses, but I definitely like Christian Bale's statement. And as the second, I'm not even sure I understand the question. Battlefield myths used to popularize
newer religion.
You mean Christians are doing that?
Well, I'm going to say yeah because he or she, he goes aspiring theologians and charismatic individuals. So let's say from a Christian perspective.
I'd like to know what an example of that would be. Are they preaching? I don't know what. I can't even think of like the World War II or I don't understand the question. Sorry.
I'll see if he can clarify.
You don't understand it either.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to think through your book if you had mentioned anything about maybe the hero motif or the hero archetype.
Yeah, I haven't really talked about warfare as much as definitely we have the Midianite slaughter and all that stuff with the Moses, which is why Christian Bale called him a psychopath. But I did think of the whole plagues when you're talking about archetypal myths. We didn't even discuss the whole plagues issue of like completely implausible nonsense as history. But
what pops in my mind when he talks about a battlefield in terms of Moses would be maybe when the Egyptians were pursuing them across the sea. I don't know. That's the only thing I could think of.
Well, in the book I also discuss each of the plagues and how ridiculous they are. Like
yes,
one plague wipes out all creatures. So what do you need a next plague for? Yeah. And there's no creatures left to kill. And it just.
I love that. So the firstborn of everyone and the animals, but there's no animals left
because the cattle have all been killed. Yeah, I mean it's just one after the other. So what I'm reminded, I mean, if there's a kind of a standard repertoire of battlefield myths, if that's what you're talking about, there's definitely a kind of a standard repertoire of plague myths that people also don't know about because they're again the milieu and ripping out of context and all that. But we know from even tales of the Greek gods that they like to strike down the silly humans out of wrath, and so there's a whole plagues mythos. There are gods of plagues in the ancient world too, and that's what we're seeing there. They've very cleverly, to make their god more powerful than all other gods, they've just amassed this group of mythical plague motifs to create the 10 plagues. So that's what I thought of the kind of battlefield motifs to be woven in. That's true. I didn't even look for that. Previous stories like the Trojan War or something like that could have been drawn upon to flesh out the Numbers 31 or something in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. Daniel put in he goes, in regards to the battlefield myths, the Book of Mormons contain many battles, and even newer Scientology contains battlefield Earth conflicts, which was actually one of L. Ron Hubbard's books. In other words, does a new religion use battles as a ratings gathering tool?
Well, I suppose. It gets people excited, you know. They always say that nothing draws a crowd like a crowd, and you get your blood pumping. We love these battle scenes. Look at speaking of new mythology, one of my favorite books and movie series of all times is the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely.
1,000 years from now, that story, if it were told orally, that would be one of our great myths, one of our great epics.
And that's how I feel about, that's how I feel about Dune. The book Dune by Frank Herbert.
Yeah. I mean, that's another kind of great epic. I love that, and The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is just absolutely full of battles. And without that tension, good fighting bad. The good fighting the orcs and Sauron and Saruman. There's no story otherwise, right? So. Sure, that makes sense. You always have to overcome evil. There's just a constant theme. The hero with the 1,000 faces, always overcoming strife and had to battle his way against the dragons. And that's classic archetypical mythology, sure.
And in this case, it was Moses battling the dragon, aka Pharaoh.
Yeah, exactly. Except in Exodus 15, it's Yahweh doing that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, ladies. Well, we're coming up on the end of the show. Acharya, let's tell everyone how they can find you, where to find your books, all of that fun stuff.
Yes, it's been quite delightful to chat with you, ladies. Especially since you actually read the material and have a grasp of where I was going with it. That's really, really nice. So my websites, again, are truthbeknown.com, stellarhousepublishing.com, freethoughtnation.com, and then astrotheology.net is a bit of a different tact because these other ones there's some criticism, and then I focus quite a bit on the Bible and Abrahamic religions, but in astrotheology, I really go into a lot of archaeoastronomy, which all fits in. This word astrotheology kind of freaks people out, but it's just astral religion or astro mythology.
Right.
It's a combination of celestial entities, their movements, their characteristics, and theology, which is the worship of them or the reverence. And so that's all it means, that it doesn't. We're not trying to make people involved in that. It's just a pure study of it. What did the ancients believe? How did they align their temple sites? What were their myths about? Very, very often they are about the sun, the moon, planets, stars, constellations, and then we also find the more mundane elements like wind, water, foliage, fauna, and so forth. But you can read. I find this very fascinating about the archaeoastronomical alignments of temples around the world. It shows a great depth to humanity. It's our common heritage from antiquity, and it shows commonality between us because we all live by the sun, so to speak. It grows our food. It brings us light. It brings us life. Even in desert regions, you still couldn't live without it. And the moon, the phases of the moon, the complexity of the moon, these are all encapsulated in myth and in stone. So in story and stone, and I like to explore those elements of ancient religion. And it shows that Homo sapiens has had the same cranial capacity for tens of thousands of years. So it's not like the ancients, our ancestors, were completely stupid and worthless. They had profound scientific observations, and this is how they recorded them, especially in pre-literate times.
Excellent. And Beth, where can we find your blog?
It's Havoc and Chaos. It is hosted on blogger.com. That's primarily my social issues blog, and then I also have Tales of the Odd, but I don't write there as often as I would like. But Havoc and Chaos is where you can find me, and you can find me on Facebook under Beth A. Hambridge. I cross-post everything between the two. Mm-hmm. But one thing I want to point out, Acharya's book is well over 400 pages. She
almost 600.
Oh, really? I was doing that off the top of my head.
Well, you were using the Kindle edition.
It's a little meaty.
It is. It's tough.
Yeah, but very meaty, and to be honest, I have the Kindle version, and I would have much preferred to have a hard copy, but for sake of speed, what I tried to do with my questions was tailor it to what I thought was pertinent for a 2-hour show. Mm-hmm. We could have done probably 7 straight days, 3-4 hours a day, and we would have not even remotely touched everything. So on that note, Acharya, would you like to come back sometime in the next month or so? And
I would.
Some of the points that you touched on Dionysus a little, but your whole section on Dionysus to me is fascinating.
All right, excellent.
Absolutely.
And we didn't touch on the prophets. or pharaoh, or oh shoot, I forgot my word. Where there's some theories that propose that he was actually a pharaoh.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, Akhenaten.
Yeah.
Hyksos.
Ooh, I like Akhenaten.
Yes, there are. I mean, there's just some stuff we did really gloss over, and I think people would be interested in it. And I think the most important thing people should take away from this, and from all of your work, is whether you agree or disagree, you have to really give it some consideration in light of, you know, mythology and its place in history, for lack of a better word, and how it is affecting. Because if anybody that follows you knows what you talked about as far as how, you know, I call it your blasphemy posts. So it does have a place to look at it, and how if you rip away the religion and focus in on the mythology, you can see where it's been twisted for that gain. So, just my little commentary.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Acharya, for coming and hanging out with us for a couple hours, and we do hope to have you drop by again. And I'm a history nerd, so I'll talk about anything to do with ancient culture. So on that note, folks, we're going to call it a night, and thank you to everyone who watched, and we'll have everything up on our regular feeds probably later this evening or tomorrow. Thank you very much, and as we're going to do from now on, I'm going to end the show with my friend David Foda's Humanist Creed. Have a great night. It's being a little slow. Woo, technology. Come on. There we go.
I know the truth and power of reason and of rational thinking, and I will use them to my advantage. I know the truth and power of educating myself and of expanding my intellectual boundaries, and I will educate myself. I know the truth and power of vanquishing ignorance, and I will do so whenever the opportunity presents itself. I know the truth and power of morality without supervision, and of true and accurate righteousness, or of obliterating tyranny, be it intellectual, emotional, or philosophical, and will work toward that goal whenever and however possible. I know the truth and power of human ingenuity. I know the truth and power of human compassion, and I will be mindful of the welfare of others. I know the truth and power of equality and fairness for all living things. I know the truth and power of the importance of our families, our friends, and our fellow men and women. I know the truth and power of human stewardship of our lands, our waters, and our skies, and I will try to act to preserve our environment. I know the truth and power of the sciences of mathematics, of physics, and of chemistry, and of the important role of these disciplines in understanding the workings of this cosmos. I know the truth and power of the rejection of all notions or beliefs that reside in the supernatural or the superstitious, and of those notions or beliefs that we are not supposed to be able to explain. And I know that these rejections are necessary for humankind's survival. I am a human being with a free mind, liberated from irrational influence and from unreasonable dogma.